Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, our guest today is Sam Carr. Sam Carr is a professor at the University of Bath with the Center for Death and Society. And we are going to be talking with Sam Carr today about his new book, All the Lonely People: Conversations on Loneliness. So in this show, we're going to be talking with you about how you can deal with loneliness in maybe a healthier way. Welcome, Sam Carr.
Thank you, Catherine. Nice to be here.
Now, Sam Carr, usually when I do my introductions, I give everyone's website. So if people want to find out more about you and your work, where should they go?
Yeah, they should head to the University of Bath website, basically, where you can find my page and the work that I do. Yeah, so the
Okay,
University of Bath.
University of Bath. And for our audience, will you give our listening audience, will you give the University of Bath website?
Yeah, it's www.bath.ac.uk.
Okay, www.bath.ac.uk.
That's right, yep.
So fantastic. So Sam Carr, you are a professor with the Center of Death and Society. What made you decide to study loneliness?
Yeah, good question. I think I've always been interested in studying the more challenging sides of being human. I guess that's another reason why I'm in the Center for Death and Society. You know, death is an equally challenging part of being human that we all have to meet and face. And so I think when you do study the more difficult parts of being human, loneliness eventually crops up because it's such a pervasive experience. It's such a common human experience, and it can be very painful and very difficult and a very hard part of our journey. And I suppose, yeah, I've always been fascinated by that part of being human and interested in finding out more about that part of being human. And it's such a complex phenomenon that I think you could spend a lifetime studying it and only scratch the surface.
Now, your book is All the Lonely People: Conversations on Loneliness. How does your book define loneliness?
Yeah, I think that the one thing to say about the book really illustrates is that loneliness, we might think that it's a universal phenomenon, and when we use the word loneliness, we're always talking about the same thing, but frequently we're not actually. And the book presents stories of loneliness that kind of demonstrate when somebody says they're lonely, you really don't know what they mean until you've listened to the story behind their loneliness. And so, in a way, loneliness has many different faces. In a way, you could say it has many different definitions. However, the one thing I think that sort of binds them all together is it's usually a sense of disconnection from the world. It's usually a sense of that, but how that looks and feels can be so different from person to person, which means you do need to listen to the story of a person's loneliness to really appreciate that disconnection.
Fantastic. I love that definition. Now, I just want to share, when I do medical intuitive readings, a lot of times I find people and they present as depressed, or they say they're depressed, but the core issue is actually loneliness, which I'm sure you can appreciate, right?
Yeah.
And in natural healing, we use flower essences. And one of the top flower essences that I am constantly recommending for people who are lonely is an Australian bush flower essence called Tall Yellow Top. And Tall Yellow Top, I love that you describe loneliness as disconnection from the world, because Tall Yellow Top bush flower essence is for alienation. And it frequently occurs when there's a disconnection between our head and our heart. And when you use tall yellow top flower essence, the way you typically take flower essences is 2 to 4 drops under your tongue 5 times a day. And with tall yellow top, you typically take it over time, maybe for a couple of weeks at a time. You notice the shifts and then you take it again. But what I find is that so many people have felt disconnected from the world for very, very, maybe their entire life, right? So that is a natural healing remedy. That's one of my go-to recommendations when I find people who are lonely. Now, Sam Carr, you've written an entire book about loneliness. In your professional opinion, what causes loneliness?
Yeah, and I mean, again, there's no one answer to that. It's what I think what causes it is that people, for so many different reasons, and there are literally infinite reasons why this can happen, develop a sense that they are completely disconnected from the world around them. And that could be because of loss, somebody who loses somebody or something that has always helped them connect to the world. They lose that. It could be because they never found it in the first place, and so they've never actually discovered that something that makes them feel connected to the world around them. And what that could be ranges from relationships to nature to the body to our capacity to connect with the world. In so many different ways, we can lose our connection to the world or never find it. And that really does speak to what you just talked about, the sense of alienation that people can feel. I live in this world, but I feel alienated from it. And the reasons for that are so complex that, yeah, you can't boil it down to one thing. And as I say, you have to listen to loneliness to really understand what it is and where it comes from. So in the book, that's what I'm really trying to do. I'm listening to people's stories of that and getting a sense for them, where did this come from? How does their disconnection manifest itself?
Great story. Now, I have to say, on a personal level, I'm 65 years old. I'm divorced. I'm not married. I don't have children. However, I'm not lonely. And it's because I feel connected. I have spiritual family, I have spiritual community. I get to interview world leading experts like yourself in natural healing. I practice yoga, I teach yoga. So there's so many ways that I'm able to connect. I have a little dog who's a little fur baby. So in your opinion, so many people will think, can I ever stop being lonely? And yet we still have times in your life when you find yourself alone, but maybe feeling lonely or maybe not feeling lonely. Is it possible to never feel lonely?
I think it's possible because I think with humans anything's possible. I think it is possible, but I tend to find that most people I've ever spoken to, especially professionally, when I've interviewed them about loneliness, there's usually a point in the lifespan where they have felt loneliness. Um, for some people, it's much more pervasive and seems to follow them around like a shadow. And they're the people I think that really do struggle to find something to really feel connected to or through which to connect to the world. But there are other people where it seems to be a sort of fleeting visit from loneliness. Often, for example, I mean, older people, we often find in our research, will often, if you live long enough, you do experience a lot of losses. So things like a partner that you were married to or with for many 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 years dies, or your body begins to break down and you can't do the things you used to do to connect to the world because various capacities have been um, degraded. You might lose your job because you finish working and you retire. So often end of life can be a phase where people lose a lot, and then there's a crisis of meaning for a lot of people where they need to rediscover a way to connect to the world. And often it is the sorts of things that you talked about. It can be spiritual connection, it can be through animal connections, relationships with non-humans. Some people manage to negotiate that part of life better than others. Some people are really struggling with that, and they never recover from losing all of those things that they really anchored them. So I think that really does depend on the person, and perhaps to some extent the sort of characteristics that person possesses.
Now, is loneliness stigmatized?
Yes, I definitely think loneliness is stigmatized, and even in lots of research that I have done, where people put their hands up and say, I feel lonely and I want to talk about it, they will still sometimes say when I arrive at their doorstep, but I just want to qualify, I'm not one of those lonely people, as though we're talking about leprosy or something. And I think the reason that happens is because we've medicalized loneliness. We've made it into something that needs to be cured, something that needs to be eradicated or abolished. And I think a lot of philosophers would argue, and psychologists, that maybe to some extent to be alive is sometimes to be lonely. And so if we all walk around pathologizing that, it's like pathologizing breathing. You know, if it's something that's inevitable and you pathologize it, you stigmatize something. And yes, I think that's a huge part of what contemporary societies have done. Yeah.
Now, what's the problem with making loneliness into a pathology to be cured?
Well, one of the problems I think is that if, and it's only an if because you can never fully verify this, if it were an inevitable part of being human, then you are making something inevitable into a pathology. And that's a problem because everyone has it. And that would mean, what would people do with it? What would people do with it in that circumstance if you pathologize something that's part of the human existence? You would be, and what I do see is people drive their loneliness underground. They hide it, they shut it away, they compartmentalize it, they feel ashamed of it, they don't want to share it. So loneliness gets locked away, a bit like a sort of demon in the basement. Um, whereas um, I've definitely felt people say to me when I've talked about that loneliness, I've acknowledged it, I've accepted that it is a part of my journey. There's a liberation to that, a sense of liberation, a sense of freedom. Like you've let that beast out of the basement, and it's not. Sometimes it's not such a beast. It's not as big a beast as you thought it was. But yes, I think if most people do experience loneliness, to make it into a pathology may well create a sense of shame and undergroundness around the phenomenon.
Now, in the United States, I believe the statistics are over 12% of adults over the age of 12 are on some form of antidepressants. Do you think that loneliness gets confused with depression?
Yeah, and I think very, very frequently, loneliness is connected to a cluster of different experiences, one of which might be depression, one of which might be anxiety, and a whole host of other psychological challenges. And it can be very difficult to disentangle them from each other. So often it can be that, well, what am I suffering from here? Is it depression? Is my depression because of loneliness? Is my loneliness because of depression? It's difficult to determine what causes what. And I would imagine it's very difficult to verify this empirically, but a lot of people who get diagnoses of depression, quite possibly loneliness is a huge part of that.
Great observation. And yet they're taking antidepressants, and that doesn't cure loneliness.
No, it certainly
No?
doesn't. No,
Yes. Or what's your experience? Do antidepressants cure loneliness?
no, I don't think they do. They definitely don't. Um, but I've definitely seen there's a line of psychiatric research that's even looking for a drug for loneliness. You know, well, people could take it and feel less alone. It's the sort of pharmaceutical obsession that we have for all kinds of different psychiatric suffering and psychological suffering. No, I don't think for me that's the root way. No.
No. And I mentioned the flower essence, tall yellow top, the Australian bush flower essence. because it's really an energetic issue, right? It's a matter of connection, right? And when we feel connected, that's the opposite of loneliness.
Yeah.
Right? Yes. Another example from my own life, there's personality typing, and you being a professor at the University of Bath, there's the Myers-Briggs. Well, I'm an INFJ. So my personality type, depending on who you listen to, is less than 2% or less than 1% of the world population. So I don't go around the world trying to find people just like me. What I do is finding the commonalities and finding ways to love and connect with everybody around me. Right? Now, Sam Carr, what does the medical literature show about how loneliness affects our mental and physical health?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of evidence, and you will have heard politicians even talking about the fact that loneliness is as big a health risk as smoking, for example. You hear people making those kind of comparisons, and it's difficult to deny. There are data to suggest that, yeah, loneliness is negatively associated with a variety of different physical and mental health issues. It is. It's bad for your health in theory, but you still got to ask the question: just because that's true, what is the answer to that? What does that mean? One way of looking at it is, goodness, if that's true, we must get rid of loneliness. Another is, well, maybe loneliness is not helping us with our health because we haven't learned to live with it well enough. We haven't learned to exist with loneliness and relate to it and accept it into our house as part of being human. And if we did, it wouldn't have such a negative effect on our health. So the answer to the fact that loneliness is associated with negative health doesn't have to be we therefore must get rid of it. It could be we can't get rid of it. It's an inevitable part of being human. We've got to learn to be with that part of us. For me, that's the more realistic aim.
I love that. And with that, let's take a break and listen to one of our commercial sponsors here at UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author. We're listening to Sam Carr, author of All the Lonely People, talking about how to learn to live with loneliness. Sam Carr, as you know, as a professor in the Center for Death and Society at the University of Bath, psychologists often talk about our shadow, which a good definition of that is the unintegrated aspect of our ego. Do you feel that loneliness is part of our shadow?
Yes, I do. I think that particularly that's true collectively. We are creating a culture where I think loneliness is being, as I said, driven underground into the territory of the shadow. Yeah, I really do. And I think I have enough evidence of talking to individuals that they do not feel they have permission. And that's like collective permission and also individual permission to acknowledge that side of themselves and that part of being human. And that's the classic sort of territory of the shadow. Yeah, so I do think it's already now absolutely a part of our collective and individual shadow for most people. Yeah.
So Carl Jung said the only way to live in our light in the light is by constantly being aware of where our shadow is. How can we learn to accept loneliness as part of an everyday part of life?
Yeah. Well, you know, the one thing I'd say that's been really surprising to me, perhaps since writing my book, is the number of people I've had letters from who have read it
Hmm.
and have simply said, thank goodness it feels a bit more normal to have a story of loneliness inside me. And I feel like reading the book is a bit of a permission for me to share my story or to say that I have one too. And it doesn't feel like that's something to be ashamed of anymore. And millions of people have an experience of loneliness, either currently or in the past. And where are the spaces and places in which we feel safe enough and unashamed to share them? And the biggest thing we learned in our studies on loneliness has been our method is part of the solution. Compassionate listening to people's
Mm,
stories is
mm.
such an important part of just allowing loneliness to be in the world. You don't have to solve it or cure it. Just allowing it to compassionately exist in the world without judgment is something that we don't have a culture of. And rebuilding that culture, and maybe it's not rebuilding, maybe it's building, I don't, maybe we've never had it, but building or rebuilding a culture where that's possible, when we have those spaces and places, to me, is one of the most important things we will do in alleviating the suffering that comes from loneliness, which paradoxically means maybe stories of loneliness are part of the remedy for loneliness, which is kind of a paradox, but true.
So I love that. Compassionate listening is part of the solution for addressing loneliness. Now, Sam Carr, you wrote a whole book about this. Do you have a personal story about loneliness?
Yeah, I have many, and they're all in the book actually. So I do present my own stories alongside those of the people that I have worked professionally with over the years. And I guess I'm doing that partly because I want the message to be reinforced that we all have our stories of loneliness. Mine, yes, I do. I had a very lonely relationship with my dad, for example, a very distant and lonely relationship with my dad, and I always wanted to be closer to him, but I never could, and it felt like a very lonely desert with my dad. Um, so for me, there was that very lonely early terrain in my early life. I've carried the loneliness of being a single parent, for example, in the last decade, 2 decades of my life, and again, I write about that in the book. It can be a very lonely journey being a single father and not a single mother. Both can be lonely, but my own experiences of loneliness are that it's visited me for sure, and my own stories are in the book alongside everybody else's.
Now, is there an upside to loneliness? Does loneliness give us a depth and strength of character?
Yeah, my own answer to that question is probably yes. And I think there's an old poem. I don't know if you ever read much of the ancient Persian poet Rumi. He
Yes.
once wrote a poem called The Guest House, where
Mm.
he said the essence of his poem is that we should invite every guest who knocks at our door, whether it be joy, sadness, loneliness, depression, into our home with the same respect and compassion. Um, Even if that guest looks like they might rip up the chairs and tear up the living room, we should see what they have to offer. And there is definitely in Jungian psychology and psychoanalysis the idea that we should ask the question, why is loneliness here first, not how do I get rid of it?
Mhm.
And why it might be here, well, there are many reasons. Often loneliness signifies, for example, the end of a phase of our life, like a relationship has ended, and we are about to be reborn in a different form. A new us is coming onto the horizon, but you've got to cross the desert from old to new, and the desert might be lonely. And so it may be a signifier of transition, a period of life where we are turning inwards because there's a lot to learn or to pick up on or to process or to metabolize. My own belief is that it's a really valuable part of existence, even though it can be very, very hard.
Now, in your professional opinion, as the author of All the Lonely People, if we notice that we feel lonely, should we try to eliminate that feeling?
My own, again, my instinct is to say no. I think we should try. My instinct now is to listen to that feeling. I would, if your first instinct is to get rid of it, I'd say maybe try reframing that a little bit and thinking about what is that I'm feeling, and really trying to listen to that feeling. What is it? What does it mean? Where does it come from? What might it be telling me? What might it reflect about me? I feel like they are very important questions to ask when we feel lonely. Not everyone feels safe enough to address them alone, and some people might feel more comfortable doing that with some help, so to speak, professionally. But I think that often it's here for a very valuable and valid reason.
Now, what is the value in sharing stories of loneliness?
Yeah, as I said to you a few minutes ago, I think that what I've learned in relation to stories of loneliness is that they might be a big part of the solution to loneliness. What I've learned, for one thing, is they hold great value to the listener and to the teller. The person who's telling the story often feels liberated, unburdened of something they frequently haven't told to anybody. Um, that they've cared, and that contributes to loneliness if you hold it inside and don't tell anybody. Sharing the story feels like you've been listened to, heard, understood, and there is a real sort of balm in that. But also for the listener, you get to empathize with somebody else's experience of loneliness. You get to empathize with that. You get to hear a story that you might have something similar inside you. Um, Hanging around. And I feel like actually they are a critical factor in the development of empathy, sharing stories of loneliness. Um, and I think that's a really important feature of the collective we would want to build upon and maintain.
Now, if Sam Carr, author of the book on loneliness, if someone listening to this broadcast feels lonely, what would you advise that person to do?
I mean, I would first and foremost advise someone not to panic about that. And I would advise them also not to feel like, if they can help it, there's something wrong with them because of that, because there isn't necessarily something wrong with you. It's a part of everybody's journey to feel lonely. But that doesn't mean finding the space and the place to share that and acknowledge that non-judgmentally wouldn't be important. Often our families can be the most judgmental. They can be the places and spaces where if we said I'm lonely, you're just told to shut up and not talk about it. Um, and don't be so stupid. But you need a space and a place where you can talk about that and not feel like you're an alien or you're ill just because you feel lonely, because it is a part of a human journey.
Now, which brings me to my next question. If our friends or loved ones feel lonely, or we know they're lonely, or they tell us they're lonely, how can we support them?
I'd say the absolute best thing you can do is non-judgmentally listen to how that feels for them and what that means for them, and not think that that means you have to quickly get rid of it for them. Because I've often seen people say, oh, let's go out on a day trip, that will get rid of it, or let's go join a yoga class or something, that will immediately get rid of it. It doesn't always get rid of it, and often it makes people feel worse. Just allowing the loneliness to be and exist and be heard non-judgmentally, which is not easy. That's easy to say for me, but it's very difficult for people to do that. But I think that's the best gift you can give someone who feels lonely.
I just met a gentleman who, I'm not making this up. He spent
Mm.
3 years taking a course in listening and how to be a better listener. So, how can each of us listen with compassion and non-judgment? How do we do that?
It's such a difficult thing to do, and I actually think if everyone could take a course in listening, it would be it would be an absolute gift to society if we could all learn how to listen. I think it would be fantastic. You've got to resist the compulsion to think you need to do something about what you're hearing. Often it's not about doing something about it, it's about allowing it to be, allowing it to exist, just allowing that person to have what's inside them. But we often don't do that because we're not comfortable with it. So I really do think there's a need for us to, well, the gentleman you just talked about, I think if we could all do that, it would be wonderful. But 3 years is obviously a long time to devote to it.
Yes, it was quite impressive. He went every Saturday morning, the entire Saturday morning for 3 years. And I asked him, I said, well, what did you learn? And he said, most of us, when we talk, when we're listening, that's just, we're waiting until we can say our piece.
Right.
But it's really being present, right?
Yes, absolutely. And it's also about having a genuine curiosity for what that person's got to bring out. You're absolutely right that I think a lot of people listen with one eye on what they're going to say next. Yeah.
Now, is there an upside to loneliness? Are there benefits to us?
Yeah, and I think we've already touched on some of them. One is that it has enormous potential to foster empathy in our society and between us as individuals and collectively. Definitely true. Um, it has a lot to teach us about being human, um, about the fact that life is not always a bowl of cherries. Sometimes there are difficult periods of it that involve suffering, involve being with ourselves, involving crossing challenging deserts, making difficult transitions in life, losing things. You know, every time you lose something and you grieve, loneliness will be a part of that. Um, you're not going to get through life without some grieving. So it has an awful lot to teach us, and an awful lot to give us, even though it's not an emotion most people would choose to feel.
And with that, let's take a break and listen to a message from one of our commercial sponsors here at UK Health Radio. You're listening to the Natural Healing Show. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author, and we're listening to Sam Carr, a professor at the University of Bath and the Center for Death and Society, about his new book, All the Lonely People. Sam Carr, as a professor in the Center for Death and Society at the University of Bath, I'm sure you're well aware about the statistics on youth suicide. And here in the US, suicide is a leading cause of death among Americans aged 30 and younger. And whenever I'm working with a younger person, I'm very careful with them because they don't have the life experience or the life skills that maybe you and I do. When younger people feel lonely, what do you advise them to do?
Yeah, again, I think it's about encouraging them or supporting them to realize, again, one, that this does not mean you have some kind of terminal illness to feel alone. At the university, for example, that I work at, every year we see new students around the age of 18 making that transition from home to college. And there's a lot of loneliness that hits those young people around that time. And a lot of them really feel like, oh my goodness, I have to escape this feeling. What's wrong with me? It's a terrible thing, but it's a very natural thing sometimes to feel lonely when you're young. It's a very natural thing. Keeping an eye on, of course, when that really evidences that someone is so alienated from the world that they can't find a way back. That can also be really challenging. But most studies of suicide will show that loneliness is a part of the equation in suicide. That people can feel so alienated from this world that they just see no way back to it.
Yes. I remember being at Brown University a long time ago. And I remember in February when it's cold and dark and snowy and gloomy, there were posters all over the university saying, Brown University thinks you're going to kill yourself right now. Come to a party. I'm not sure that was the right solution, but it was the message. This is the time when a lot of this happens. So if loneliness is a part of people feeling suicidal, what would you advise a suicidal person?
Well, I think what we advise for most suicidal people is talk about it before you act, for sure. If you can find a safe space or a person to talk about this with, non-judgmentally and without prejudice, then I think that is the sort of emergency space that you need when you're in that particular position. But finding that is critical, and it's certainly in university structures in the UK, we put a lot of emphasis on making sure, or trying to make sure, students feel that they have that space or access to that if they need it, and making clear that it's there. But it's in a bigger sense, it's about also a lot of our students around the age of 18, 19, they haven't grown up acknowledging that loneliness is part of being human. They've grown up with the idea that it isn't. And so when they do feel it for the first time in a big way, it's a terrifying experience and a terrifying phenomenon. So I feel like building a culture where loneliness is a bit more normalized as opposed to pathologized might well be a very important step we can collectively take.
Sam Carr, author of All the Lonely People, do you feel if loneliness is inevitable, then in your professional opinion, what is the best way for us to deal with it?
Well, yeah, if it's inevitable, learning to live alongside it and with it,
Mhm.
and perhaps to respect and honor it for what it has to offer as part of the human experience, is a much more manageable, realistic, and perhaps even dignified goal, in my opinion.
Now, Sam Carr, you had shared with us very generously that you've had the experience of being a single father and that you've felt lonely from your father. How have you learned to deal with loneliness?
To be honest, when I experienced it as a child, I don't think, and this is true of many children that I've talked to about loneliness, I don't think children often even have the language to identify themselves as lonely. So I've talked to many lonely children who they never mention the word lonely in the conversation, but it's very clear that they're incredibly lonely children. Um, and I think that when I was a child, you kind of don't deal with it. You just get washed along in the tide of life. And it's only later that you look back. And I've had many adults say this to me, goodness, only later do I look back on my life and realize how lonely I was at that phase and that phase and that phase. But I didn't have the language or the skills or the tools to identify myself as lonely at that time. So I just sort of suffered, and it might have got called something else. But I think for me personally, certainly in my younger days, I didn't deal with it. I suffered from it, and I think it really caused me a lot of grief, and I felt like I needed to cure it, like everybody else. Um, but the older I get, and the more I reflect on loneliness, and the more that I come to the realization that I think that it is a part of everybody's journey. My relationship with it will likely change. Um, I think not everybody has to do it that way. Maybe we can create generations in the future where people are sort of loneliness literate. You know, they understand it. They have a better relationship with it. But I don't think we're moving in that direction, actually. I think we're moving the opposite.
Now, I will say that for myself, because I think you and I agree that loneliness is part of the human existence, that one of the ways I deal with loneliness is through a regular prayer practice. And
Right.
I have a group of people that I pray for every single day, usually twice a day. And I pray for them
Mm,
by name, and I do a loving kindness meditation. So, for example, may Sam be well and free from illness. May Sam be safe and free from harm. May Sam be happy. May Sam be at peace. And I spend time thinking about each person and sending them loving kindness. And that helps me to feel connected to people that I care about. And it's a very simple thing that we can all do. So, Sam Carr, in your book, you've interviewed people about the experience of loneliness. What have you learned from interviewing so many people about their loneliness?
Yeah. I mean, for one, I've learned that it frequently feels to them like a very unique experience because it usually is. The story of everyone's loneliness is a little bit different. And I've definitely learned that loneliness seems to stem from either loss of connection or lack of connection in the first place, or not being able to find connection. And often the things that people are looking for to connect to are other people. I think that's the most common thing we're looking to connect to. And I like your example there because you're almost talking about something spiritual, a connection to something that isn't just about other people. It's about some sort of bigger spiritual sense. And I have learned that some people really find that their loneliness is soothed from spiritual means and spiritual mechanisms, and from spaces and places that are not just about other humans, because often other humans, as much as they are well intentioned, can often be the cause of loneliness as well as the solution. I've heard a lot of people say, well, my marriage is the most lonely thing about my life.
Mm.
I'm married to this other person, I've been with them for 40 years, but it's an incredibly lonely marriage because they don't know who I am and don't see me. So I think often the answer might not just be about people, but other spiritual, cultural, bigger practices. For me, for example, my dreams are a big part of my of me feeling connected to something bigger. Every week, I work with a dream analyst, and we explore what the dream world sends me. And I definitely feel like there's a bigger spiritual other sending me dreams every night, that has my back. And that's a real sense that I didn't have as a younger human being.
I love that example. Now, in spiritual life, as you know, we talk about the experience of oneness. And a good definition of oneness is it's actually a feeling, it's a felt sense of deeper connection. And
Yes.
if you're listening to this, you may have felt this, for example, if you're out walking in nature, right? Or in the act of prayer or meditation. In your experience, is oneness the opposite of loneliness?
I mean, the sort of the best position from which I can answer that question is my own personal position as a human. And yeah, when you talk about oneness in the description you just gave, I definitely can identify with moments in my life where I've felt that oneness. And yes, I think I would see it as a real sense of feeling like your piece of the mosaic fits. You fit into the world in the way that you're supposed to sometimes. You feel that real sense of oneness. Um, it's interesting in all the people I've interviewed, it's very rarely something that people talk about because I don't think it's something our culture prioritizes, practices and spaces and places where people can feel that or develop practices that help them to feel that way, which I think are so important and so valuable. I think the main place I've seen it in interviews with people is in religious experiences that people have described a connection to God, a connection to some kind of religion. But yeah, I think you can find that experience in so many ways, and I feel like educating people or helping people and supporting people towards that might be the most critical part of alleviating loneliness.
Fabulous information. Now, Sam Carr, you are the author of All the Lonely People. Right now, you have a global platform because people all over the world are going to be listening to what you have to say. If you would you share from your heart and soul a message for people who might be feeling lonely right now? What
Yeah.
would you have to say to them?
Yeah, I think I would say that I really wholeheartedly believe that feeling lonely right now, in the future, in the past, is absolutely a fundamental part of everybody's journey, almost everybody's journey. So you shouldn't feel like you're less human because you're lonely. You should feel like you are human because you're lonely. And experiencing that as part of everyone's journey and part of the life journey. And if you can truly believe that, I think that's a hugely important part of combating loneliness.
Beautiful message. You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. The one and only Sam Carr is the author of the lovely book, All the Lonely People, Conversations on Loneliness. He's a professor at the University of Bath in the Center for Death and Society. And you can find out more about Sam Carr and his wonderful work at the Bath University website, which is www.bath.ac.uk. And remember that feeling lonely is a normal, natural part of human existence. And as you learn to be present with your own loneliness in compassion and empathy, you can heal yourself naturally. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.